women's rights are under threat. And I think the idea that of your ability just to be able to choose and be in an open society that values women that are child-free by choice or have alternative different lifestyles around how they want to bring children or not into this world is really important.
I'm Keltie Maguire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Today, I have a child-free story for you. And aside from a lot of the usual exploration that we do, looking at how this person made their decision, had they always known they wanted to be child-free, answers to those types of questions and more, we're going to be delving into some areas that we haven't really talked about where it concerns being child-free, namely being child-free at work, what that looks like. Are there ramifications for choosing the child-free path? And what does it look and feel like to be a child-free person in the workplace? We also explore topics like child-free sort of on the political, societal level, the things that are happening in our world where it concerns women's reproductive choices and decisions and how much we're seeing a rollback on that, especially in places like the US. So very excited for you to meet today's guest. She promised me lots of strong opinions and that she had a lot to say, and she definitely delivered. This was such an interesting, informative, fun conversation. So today we are talking to Kate Brightwell, who is a lobbyist and tech public policy specialist based in London. Kate has previously worked for a leading US tech company and global management consultancies and the UK election regulator. Her passion for politics has enabled her to focus on public policy that impacts society and is what has driven her career to date. Kate is currently taking a career break, which she describes as her maternity leave without a baby. Yes, we're going to be talking about this. And during this period of fun employment, she is thinking long and hard about what comes next while enjoying traveling in her camper van around Europe and spending overdue time with loved ones. Kate also has a side hustle as a dog sitter. And yes, we're going to be talking about the dog sitting because you all know I love my dogs. Please welcome to the podcast, Kate Brightwell. Kate, I'm super glad that Kristen connected the two of us because we've come to get to know each other somewhat well over the last few months. And that being said, I've never gotten the full story about your child-free choice. All I know is that you were enthusiastically, adamantly child-free by choice, and that you've known for a long time that this is your path. And so I have the suspicion it's never quite as simple as people make it out to be when they say that. Maybe it is. So before we get into your child-free choice, I'd love to hear from you just a little bit about who you are and what we need to know about you.
Gosh, what do you need to know about me? Well, I'm a single cat lady living in London. And
I love single cat ladies.
Yeah, although I'm more of a single dog lady, to be honest. So yeah, in my mid-40s, I've been a lobbyist for 20 years. So deep interest in public policy and politics. I have a camper van that I am currently enjoying traveling a lot because I'm currently on a career break this year.
Okay, awesome. Well, I know every time we connect, you've been doing something cool. I think you were in Spain or somewhere in the Mediterranean. You were at the Olympics this year. It sounds like you're living a good life. So I look forward to hearing about all the adventures, why you're actually more of a dog lady than a cat lady. We have to get into the dog thing today because I know you're having a love affair with dogs right now, which we'll explain more about that later. But first of all, tell me, have you literally always known you didn't want to have kids? Like, tell me about going back as long as you can remember. Was there ever a thought that you would be a mom?
No, it really has been that.
Great answer.
Really has been that easy. So I have an older sister who is almost 4 years older than me, who's always loved children. And so I just can really remember when we were children and we got given these baby dolls to play with, which I always find deeply disturbing that one of the first things children play with, particularly girls, is like playing being a mom. And I was just like, I don't connect with this at all. And I used to just push my baby doll under my bed and kind of carry on doing something else. And I wanted to be a vet, so I used to just play around with my cat. And so there was this early thing of my sister going, why don't you want to play with this doll? So I didn't quite connect then. And then I think it was, when you get to a point where you're learning biology and all the sex education stuff and realizing that you have a choice about whether or not you have a child, this kind of amazing advent of contraception and realizing I had a choice in it. So I think I remember very, very young saying to my mom, I'm never going to get married and I'm never having children. And I was very adamant about this choice. I've always been a very forthright, opinionated child. And, what's happened is really that hypothesis that I had before I had even had periods, sort of being tested, challenged quite a lot, as I'm sure we'll get into. And then, progressing through my 20s and 30s, a lot of my friends having children, my parent, my sister having children, and it absolutely being confirmed to me through every one of those experiences that being a mum was just not something for me. And now I feel I'm in this kind of period of acceptance. So I'm kind of out the other side. People don't ask you so much, particularly when you've got grey hair and you're kind of, maybe it's impolite if you haven't had children by this point. But yeah, I would say it's definitely been kind of from just absolutely knowing, tested, challenged, and now fully accepted as my choice.
Yeah. I've had a few women on the podcast who've had a similar story to yours. And I think, first of all, there can be initial frustration from women who are on the fence when they hear that someone has just been totally unwavering, because there's this feeling of like, I don't relate to that. How? And if I am wavering, if I am on the fence, maybe that's not my story. Maybe it means I should have children. And yet I think there's so much we can learn from those who have, and I don't want to say always confidently embraced it, because it sounds like you were confident that that was your path. But as you've mentioned, there were challenges, you were tested, and it's been a journey for you to learn to embrace that more. So I want to get into that in a second, but I know that you're going to have a lot that's really valuable to share with us today. And so listen up, or keep your attitudes open, listeners, if you will, because I know Kate has a lot of wisdom to share, even if you don't identify with those early starts to the child-free choice. What was the response like when you told your mom, I'm not getting married, I'm not having kids? Like, what was the response of your family?
Well,
your mom in particular.
You'll be unsurprised to hear that almost every single time I said this, and I said it a lot when I was a child, was, oh, you'll change your mind. Oh, you'll change your mind. And that went on for quite a long time. But specifically talking about my mother. So I was in a relationship for 14 years, and I met this person when I was 19. We broke up in my mid-30s, and I remember around 21, 22. So we've been together a couple of years, and my mum had kind of got to this point of accepting that I wasn't going to have children. And I really was quite sure about this. And she's like, you're going to break his heart. You're going to break his heart because he's going to want children and you don't. And so you try and broach this conversation with a 21-year-old that you've been going out with. And he's like, of course, I don't want kids. Like, whatever. Like, why are we even having this conversation? And kind of got, put to the side for many years. But I think this idea that the way that I've always thought about it is, around that age, you're always asked like what you want to be when you grow up, or what are you going to study at university. And if you don't know if you don't have a kind of clear idea of what you want to do, then people kind of make you think that you should have these clear ideas about how you want your future to be. And I see a decision about whether or not you want to have children is exactly that, like spending some time thinking about the life that you want to lead and what it could look like and the components that would be in it, which I'm sure a lot of the people that come and work with you when they're kind of like unsure about this decision, that's like a really responsible thing to do with your life, to think about these things. So when someone tells you, oh, you're going to change your mind, it's actually quite insulting, because you're like, no, I've actually thought about this quite a lot. And I mean, maybe just slightly going off on a tangent, but, it is the one, particularly men of a certain age can kind of be asking you lots of probing questions about it. And I've often said, well, can you tell me about the time when you decided that you did want children? And, not to overgeneralize about one gender, but, a lot of men are like, oh, well, I didn't really think about it. And, she just, that's what you do, isn't it? And that's what my wife wanted to do. And I sort of just went along with it. And like this idea of something so life-changing that you wouldn't consciously think about is like absolutely bonkers to me. So that idea of it getting kind of dismissed is as I say, I think it's a little bit insulting.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And for me, it's also been shocking. I mean, marriage is another good example. I remember, and I've probably told this story on here, but when Chris and I were thinking about getting married, which I always have to say the caveat, like for visa reasons, which, come take me, German Polizei. I maybe shouldn't make that invitation. We're legitimate. We've been together for 15 years, but we were really like, is that reason enough? It wasn't a value of ours to marry. And asking people, so why did you marry? And people would say, well, that's just what you do. And it's like, well, no, it's not just what you do. If it's not like, is it what you want to do? And similarly, I see so many people consider having kids the same way of like, it's unquestioning. And I've had parents privately connect with me and say, I'm so glad you're hosting these conversations, not just on the podcast, but the work I do in general, because they said, I didn't even really know I had another choice. Like intellectually, I guess, yes, I probably would have said I could opt out, but I don't think many people, until they're at this crossroads, or unless similar to yourself, they have this really firm knowing this is not what I want. I think very few people question this. And to your point, like biggest decision we make, why are we not questioning it?
Yeah, I think that's really true. I guess the one thing that was still a hypothesis for me until I was, getting older was this idea of, that your biological clock's going to kick in. And, there were lots of people that told me this and said, I never wanted children. And then the biological clock kicked in. And so around the time when it was literally kicking in for all of my friends, visibly, there was I'm in quite a large university group, which Kirsten's part of. And every one of them except me and another have had children, and most of them have had more than one. And so I was at this period of time where they're all just, and I was like, I just don't have these feelings. And, they'd express to me the physiological feelings they were having, the kind of emotional urges. And I'm just like, I just haven't been built like that. And it was, that is quite a feeling of othering, which is, there was a sort of lack or something like, am I less of a woman, or have I not been built correctly or something? And so that was more of my challenge to, rather than being on the fence and unsure of my decision, just like reconfirming to myself that I am still the whole woman, and I'm not less than because I haven't sort of had these physiological urges, as it were.
Yeah. It's really interesting because even though I talk a lot about, I was on the fence for so long, I was undecided. Virtually no part of me really wanted to have children. What I struggled with and what kept me on the fence was contending with like, but why don't I want children? And what's wrong with me? And this feeling of brokenness. And, to your point, like feeling unwomanly or unfeminine, which I've talked about this before. Like this isn't necessarily a trait or characteristic I held dear, like, oh, I need to be like super feminine. I need to be like this good woman. And so it was kind of curious where that infiltrated my psyche. But I'm interested, like, first of all, why do you think you didn't have, with your best guess and, hindsight now, why do you think you didn't have those same urges and feelings as other women? What's your explanation for that now from where you stand?
Gosh, I don't think I really do have a clear idea. I think the thing that comes to mind for me is when I was growing up, my grandfather was a huge influence on me and looked after us when we were kids, kind of after school. He's one of the reasons that kind of instilled this passion for politics and where my life has gone with that and with travel. But so my grandmother died when I was 3, so I have very, very minimal memories of her. And I saw this person living this really fulfilling life as a single man. And of course he wasn't, because he had 2 children of his own. But in this period of the period that I saw him was this incredible person that had all these hobbies, was going to the pub and like reading and just like had this full life. And I didn't see him with other children. Ironically, he was looking after us, but I didn't see him in that light. And I think that was quite an inspiration of like, oh, you could have this life. And I think he just opened my eyes to all the things, the potential of the things that you could do.
Yeah.
If I think about it sort of clearly of how it happened, I started to think about what the types of things I wanted in my life, the type of life I wanted to lead. And having children would have just complicated that and just didn't fit. But I think from a physiological perspective, probably not want to get too deep here, but I've just always really struggled with just the physiology of being a woman, right? I
Yeah.
was a very competitive swimmer. I hated having periods and not being able to compete when I was a teenager. I found the fact that by the time I was having periods, knowing that I didn't want children, what a complete and utter pain in the arse that is if you have no use for that equipment. So it's been quite a journey for me to sort of make peace with that part of my body, which essentially is redundant. And I think there has definitely been some disconnect between my brain and my body for that very reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I ask you that not because I expect that you've got this like particular insight or clear answer. It's just something I've reflected on because and I still do sometimes. I was diagnosed a couple of years ago with endometriosis, and I think, okay, that can relate to hormonal imbalances, of course. And is that not what gave rise to me, like why I didn't have these kinds of feelings? And then I remind myself, many women with endometriosis have a desire for children and go on to have kids. And I think there's just so many different factors that sort of intersect that it becomes almost impossible. And in a way, it doesn't really matter why we are who we are. I think it's about finding that acceptance and, to use your words, to make peace with the way we feel or don't feel about this matter. And so I'm guessing it's probably been a long journey with a lot of different factors involved. But like, what would you say has helped facilitate this shift from there's something wrong with me to what I hope today you believe, it sounds like you do, like there's nothing wrong with me for wanting not to have children?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was quite fleeting. And I don't know whether it was about being wrong with me. It just was like I'm such a social person and quite an extrovert and love being in a group. And I felt there was quite a period of time, like in my 30s, where it was difficult to have a conversation with my friends on a connecting level because it's like I can't connect with what you're doing. So I think it was more of a frustration from that perspective. Okay. I mean, I think that's an element of it. One thing that's been kind of challenging is as my friends have had children and I've played with them and cuddled them and they're like, oh, you're quite good with kids, so you're quite maternal and I like playing with kids. And it's like, that doesn't mean I want them. Like, yes, or then that's more the assumption that just because you don't want children or you had no biological urge, you actually hate them and you don't want to spend any time with them.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of kind of stereotypes that people can project on you if you have been and I have been very declarative over the years about not wanting them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned that there's been people's opinions and there's been resistance from others. I mean, who have those people or groups of people predominantly been? Has it been the men you dated? Has it been friends? Like, who has said, like, no, you're going to change your mind? Like,
literally everyone, Keltie. Like, the one that really sticks out to me, the one that really sticks out to me is I went to Madeira with my best friend. Gosh, I think it was like the year before she had her first child. And we met this amazing couple from Paris, and they were a few years younger than us. So I think it was like around the time he was like early 30s, very successful entrepreneur. And we'd had the greatest time with them. We just like met them at this hostel, hung out with them loads. They seemed like very similar kind of viewpoints on like a life and politics and everything. And then we just kind of so glibly said on the last night, well, I'm not going to have children.
Yeah.
And I was still with my partner at this point. So I think we've been together like 12, 13 years. And he was like, what do you mean you're not going to have children? I was like, I'm not going to have children. And I mean, this is a conversation like 15 years ago. And I still remember it as clear as day. And he, I got the head tilt and he's like, oh, I just feel, I really pity you. I feel really sorry. Or maybe there was a language thing. He just was like, I feel really sorry for you. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he's like, oh, you're just going to miss out on so much. Like you're going to miss out like in life not being a mother. And I mean, I obviously had some quite strong words about that because also he was a relative stranger and was providing this opinion of how I was going to feel about my own life, about something at that point I'd been thinking about for like 15, 20 years. So it's like, how dare you? So it's been everyone, literally everyone. I can't sort of narrow it down to a group. And I think something's happened as I've got older. I've bothered less about trying to change someone's opinion or to forcefully explain why I'm child free
Yeah.
by choice. And it just has stopped. Like, people do just stop asking after a certain point, which is good.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just really feel
it's nice getting older.
Yeah,
for that reason.
It is. And I feel like it really makes me feel for women that do want children, but for whatever reasons can't, or they're going through IVF or any of those things, and just how incredibly insensitive these kinds of questions can be for people. So yeah, my heart really does go out to people who, and maybe that's why I have been so forthright in explaining it, because it's like, maybe if I can do it, and then you won't actually ask anyone in future because you realize how rude it is.
Yeah. Do you remember some of what you said to that guy? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I said, he said that I would be missing out on life. And I remember thinking, I absolutely won't be missing out on life, because I know that it will provide me with this freedom and autonomy to do all the things that I want to do. And be, I talk a lot with my friends around, like, you choose your urban family, your family of choice, and the people that you hang around with. And like, there's no question in my mind that I sort of have less loving relationships or less of a human experience because I don't have children. And that's just a complete misconception from his perspective, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Interested, this relationship that it ended, did kids play a role in that?
Not explicitly. I mean, it was definitely something within my, so we broke up like 10 years ago, and it was my choice, and there was lots of reasons for that. But around a couple of years before we broke up, his sister had a kid, and there was a period where he was like, of course I don't want children. Or I'm not even thinking about it in my 20s. Then, for various reasons, he was quite. He had a number of health conditions, so he was like, "Of course, we're not going to have kids at this point." And I was like, "Just for the record, I'm absolutely not having children." And I think that
at any point,
I think that was also a point where everyone really did. I'm talking about close friends and family stop, because it's like, well, she has this partner that she literally could have children with. They both, she's got a good job. They're stable, all of those things. Like, the conditions are perfect in many ways. And it's like, and she still doesn't want to have them. Maybe she
doesn't want to have them.
maybe she did know what she was talking about with her own life. Shock. But I think there was something in, obviously men can, we were the same age, and obviously men can have children a lot later than women. And we were around 33, 34 when we broke up. And I said, look, we could stay together for another 10, 20, 10 years. And because he was quite sick, and it was like, and you'd get better and then suddenly be like, I want to have children. Like, I've got my life back. And that's just never going to be the case with me. And the reason that I thought that might be a possibility is because when he was around his niece, he was like, wow, I didn't realize you could feel like this about children. Like, when they're your family, there's this like whole other connection. And I just watched him with this little kid, and I was like, oh man, that guy wants kids. And so it definitely wasn't the main factor of why we broke up. But like, I was never going to be able to give them that. But I mean, specifically on dating, it's great these days on dating apps where you can literally specify, that you don't want children. So I don't know if that's, meant that people have swiped not the wrong way, but, discounted me. But it's something I have brought up like pretty early on in relationships, because it's a big one.
Are you open to dating people who have children from a previous relationship?
Not really.
No, fair. I think it's something that as a child-free person, you need to have clarity on, because I have friends who are child-free by choice who are open to that. And I have others who are like, listen, I decided to opt out for myself. I don't want to opt in for your kids, like in any way, shape, or form, which is also totally fine. So
yeah, I think if they were quite a lot older, but it would definitely. I guess from a dating app perspective, I think I would sort of screen out those people. But obviously, if you met someone more organically,
old-fashioned,
but it would not be something I would want, really.
So it sounds like it hasn't been that much of a factor in recent years then, because you can, as you say, screen for that? Or would you say it's something that's like been a bone of contention in potential relationships or
No,
relationships?
I mean, I will say something, and maybe it might be a little controversial and
We're all for that here.
a little unsettling. I have often been in social situations where men have begun talking to me, found out that I'm child free by choice, and their fathers, often fathers of quite young children, and often, we're talking parties and nightclubs and that
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And they've almost started confessing to me that they never wanted children, that they only had them because their wife wanted them, that it's a complete like it's changed their life, they hate it, blah blah blah. And then there's this kind of adoration of this young, not so young, free woman that has consciously made this decision. And I can
Yeah.
literally see like an attraction in their eyes of like this, oh my goodness, if I'd only fallen in love with a person like that, and look how different my life would be. And that,
Yeah. Wow.
to a point that I've often, sometimes that's super attractive, someone's finding your lifestyle choices attractive, but it's happened just a little too many times, and I'm just like, just go home to your wife.
Yeah.
You made
You
that
creep.
decision. Well,
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
a couple of times, just to be really controversial for here, it's just been like, I'm sorry, like, there's this thing called free will. Like, could you not just like
Yeah.
put a condom on? Could you not just speak for yourself? Could you not, like, I'm sorry, but like, you are literally physically impregnating someone most of the
Yep.
time. Or if you're not doing
Yep.
that, you're very consciously going to an IVF clinic and all of
Yeah.
these things. So to sit there and say to me that you sort of have this no agency and you've been completely hijacked into becoming a father and your life is terrible, I'm just like, just like,
Yeah.
fuck off, basically.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
but it's happened to few, this sort of and it happens with my girlfriends too.
Yeah.
They will they come to my house as a safe haven to kind of confessional that motherhood isn't what they got cracked up to be, and that they, you know, they but then again it gets into, oh, you have so much freedom and your life is so wonderful, and this kind of coveting of the grass is greener on the other side, which is
Yeah.
not always helpful either. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious if there's something, because I agree. I think, as people without kids, it's like we do become sort of that safe haven, or that place that parents often feel they can go to or talk to openly, which I think is wonderful. I'm curious if there, because I'm sure some people listening might be like, oh my God, I knew it. And these parents are all unhappy and they're regretful. Would you say there's like a through line when you hear about people saying parenthood wasn't all, or hasn't been all it was cracked up to be? Is there like one thing you notice again and again, like where they feel like they've been misled, or where they're feeling disappointed, like as a cautionary tale, if you will?
I would say like a lack of autonomy or a lack of choice. The fact that they have to think, the responsibility of it. I would
Yeah.
also say another element of perhaps they thought that the division of labor would be more equitable between their partner. And I think
Yeah.
despite it being 2024, like if you're going to breastfeed, you're going to be off work, you've got the loss of income, you know, there are just these fundamental ways in which women get screwed
Yeah.
over by being a mother. And if the partner is, oh, I'm bringing in all the money, but then I'm not helping around the house or with the support. So I think it's sometimes just around it being really, really hard, and that
Yeah.
you maybe just want some time off. But I would say a lot of my friends are incredibly good at carving out time for themselves, which usually actually means spending time with me or doing things together. And,
Yeah.
I think that it's been really interesting having such a good group of girlfriends and how different ones have sort of approached motherhood. And the ones that
Yeah.
have really kind of nailed it, as far as I'm concerned, are those that have still remained themselves as well, and making sure
Yeah.
that they haven't just kind of morphed into this into motherhood. Because really, I have seen it with a lot, like there's this intense couple of years, but you do come out the other side, and you got to remember who you were before you were a mother, right?
Yeah.
Because you're still in there somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it's usually just the tiredness and the relentlessness of it.
Yeah. I would love to talk about something we haven't tabled at all in this podcast. And I'm kind of happy that we're talking about it before we're talking about this perspective from what it is to be a mom, and that is work and this decision. I want to talk about being child free at work for a few reasons. One, you've mentioned you've got a few hot takes and some opinions on the matter. Of course, having worked in policy, having been at the executive level in past roles, kind of having that bird's eye view of like what's going on within organizations. I'm interested to get your take in a few things. So, just generally speaking, what has your relationship been like with work as a child-free woman? And has that evolved over like earlier childbearing years versus where you're at in your career now?
Yeah. So I would say the earlier years, was worried, despite the obvious HR requirements or such like, that you wouldn't be discriminated against because you were of a childbearing age. So I think I remember being quite cautious in interviews, or maybe even dropped it into interviews, that I wasn't going to go off and have children. Which is probably a disservice to a lot of women. And I will gratefully say that in certainly latter years and working for US tech companies, there has been a very pro hiring of people. It feels like it's not as acute as it was maybe in the noughties. And I don't know whether that was my projection in the noughties that was the case, but certainly felt I wanted people to, people knew I was with my partner for a certain amount of time, to sort of like what I was saying earlier. It's like, well, she's coming up to 30. They've been together nearly 10 years. Like, surely they're going to have a kid. So, yeah, it's definitely been something that's played on my mind. But as I've got older and had more years under my belt, I think you get to a point where you realize your experience is what carries you on that front.
Yeah. Okay. I'm interested if you ever felt either discriminated against or unfairly advantaged because you don't have children in the workplace and in your career.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would frame it like that. I would say one of the overriding experiences of working for an American tech company has been a feeling of othering. And this is sort of, I was working in a very global team, but my impression is from corporate America and working with a lot of Americans over decades is, family, marriage, getting married, having lots of kids is kind of like a pinnacle of a marker of success.
Yeah.
And so, people are very open and declarative. There's this sort of period of time where everyone's taking their kids to college and everyone's kids are being selected to college. And so they're all telling you about all of that. There's, the base, like there's just a lot of stuff people talk about their kids. Then there's, people who are on maternity leave and all of these things. So you can fall into the trap. And I definitely fell into this trap of feeling quite othered quite a lot of the time. That I was the only person that didn't have children, and like I'm just surrounded by people that are in these kind of heteronormative 2.4 families. Until probably 3 or 4 years ago, we were at an offsite all together, and an HR facilitator, I think they do this quite often with these types of things. There's maybe 50 people there for a sort of globalish team. And they did the kind of, right, you go over to this side of the room for one answer and over here, and it's like, I've got sisters, I've got brown hair, I've I swim or whatever. And so we were doing a bit of that, and then it was, I think one of the questions was like, I have children, or so. I mean, maybe it wasn't as overt. So I thought I was going to be like the only person over on this side of the room, and it turned out there was loads of us.
Yeah,
but we're kind of like this silent, like significant minority that don't kind of get a voice. Like for example, I will talk about like during COVID. COVID was, all these people at home, like thinking about your homeschooling, you've had this transition, your schools are shut, you're all at home. And that's all like the kind of senior leaders talked about when they would be cheering up the employees. And it's like, actually, you've got a significant group of people that don't have children, actually at home on their own. It's as if you're homeschooling, which, don't get me wrong, I'm sure was absolutely horrendous, but it was like, it was the only category of employee being catered to. And I did actually call it out. I wrote I gave some feedback, on that. So I would say yeah, there's definitely been that feeling of othering, or that I'm the odd one out, which has not necessarily led to me feeling kind of included, which is, I think, quite a big thing in corporates.
Yeah. And it's interesting because those examples you give, like, those aren't things that, like, we can see on paper, and they're not necessarily overt decisions that are being made, but they're kind of insidious, and just in the way that we talk about things and the assumptions that are made. I can see how it would be very much an experience of othering. And I say I can see it because I've been self-employed for some time, and I'm trying to think how old I would have been, probably early 30s when I was last in a company. But I can see how just even the examples that people give, the water cooler chit chat, all those things can really probably make you feel outside, when, like you say, it's like a lot of people, I think it's like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people in most developed countries are not going to be having children, either by choice or circumstance. So it's a lot of people. And it's also interesting what you say is, like, you didn't really even realize how many others there were, because I don't know. I guess because, like, why do you think we don't talk about this decision? Is it sensitivity for those who can't have kids, or is it because it's so quote normal to have children?
I don't know. I guess unless you have your children during that period, if you're a woman and you have your kids during that period of work, then everybody knows that you've had a kid because you're walking around the office pregnant, right? But there could be unless. I don't know. I kind of oscillate quite a lot on this idea of how much of your personal life you bring into work and how much you don't. And I can understand people not wanting to talk about their children, but I would say, just as a massive generalization about Americans, that there is it is definitely seen as a marker of success, and you talk about these things. And we did this one activity sort of again during COVID stuff, of like show and tell, or share a photograph of something meaningful to you. And of course 80% of the team share photographs of their family and their children and all of those things. And again, that just does make me think about those people that are maybe trying for a family, or they feel less than. I've done a lot of kind of soul searching, and I'm happy that I don't have that life, but it's sort of I mean, my picture was of my camper van.
I didn't think to ask, so I'm glad you volunteered that. I'm trying to think what mine would be. I mean, mine would be probably my dog and my husband, I guess. I mean, it's like a natural, normal thing, these close relations we have. So we know that for so many of us who are on the fence about this decision, that we can grapple with it for a very long time. I was personally going back and forth on whether I wanted to have kids or stay child-free for probably close to a decade by the time I really committed myself to making a decision. And when I reached that point, that decision-making point where I realized that this answer is not magically going to appear, and that it's something that we need to concretely, consciously decide, it was sort of this moment where it was like, enough is enough already. I am tired of going in circles. I'm tired of the pros and cons lists and hoping the answer will just show up. I'm tired of reading the books or talking about this ad nauseum or discussing it in therapy. And if you relate to this, if you are also at this sort of breaking point with your decision, if you're ready to finally make a decision about whether to have kids or stay child-free, I want to invite you to join me for the fall session of my Kids or Child-Free group coaching program. This is a 3-month-long program, and we're going to be kicking off the next round in the middle of October. This is for those of you who are on the fence, you're trying to make a decision, nothing you've been doing has elicited a clear choice. And if you are ready to do something different, I want to invite you to join me as your guide to take you through this process and help you get clear on the right path for you among a group of like-minded women who are also grappling with the same decision. I want to invite you to check out my Kids or Child-Free group coaching program. Again, we kick things off in the middle of October, and I will link to the details in the show notes of today's episode, which you can also find the information about under the Work With Me tab over at kidsorchildfree.com. I'm interested, you've referred a few times, and of course, you mentioned your most recent roles have been with large US companies. Do you think that attitudes or that emphasis on family and children isn't as prevalent in the UK?
So I guess I would say that the other companies I've worked for, we've had to focus on some regulation around changing maternity leave and paternity leave. I think paternity leave or maternity leave is very it's very generous compared to other countries, etc. So it's not that element. I guess the one thing I'd want to bring up is I've always been involved in women's networks in certainly in the large corporates that I've worked for, and even probably around 10 years ago, I was getting more and more frustrated about and it has changed, but the agenda of these women's groups. So it's like, let's get all the women employees together. And 101 is like, we're going to talk about, let's talk about mothers returning to the office. Let's talk about work-life balance with your kids and all this. And, I probably sound like the grumpy single cat lady, but I'm like, but equally, like I've had a lot of feedback from younger people. I've raised this in sort of, in our industry, there aren't that many women. So sort of a women in public affairs group and all of these things. And I'm like, you cannot distill women in the workplace down to mothers in the workplace and what. I was like, there's no, well, if there is a fathers group, they're all patting themselves on the back and like kind of virtue signaling about how great they are picking little Jimmy up from the nursery every afternoon. And they're kind of going, oh, I feel like I can't have it all and I'm pulled in all these ways. I just find that is such a reductive way of when thinking about women in the workplace. We're so much more than that. And we have so many bigger issues that we should be talking about in the workplace. So that was my, it was kind of like a broken record, but every time I sort of think about the focus of different speakers or what we were doing, I was like, can we just broaden it out? Like, please. It's so reductive to go there. And I wouldn't say that's necessary. And, that's been in the UK as well. That's not a US thing necessarily.
Yeah. I'm interested. Where would you say that organizations should be putting their focus, specifically where it concerns women in the workplace, but broadly speaking, if there's so much emphasis and neither Kate or I, I'm sure, are saying that we shouldn't be talking about those things. It's just that we shouldn't just be talking about those things.
Precisely. Thank you for articulating that. I wouldn't want to be like misinterpreted. Menopause has been the one that's kind of come up quite a lot lately. If I think about other things that our women's group did, big endometriosis awareness, mental health awareness. Another kind of pet peeve of mine really is that a lot of soft skills training for women is focused on them being more assertive or being more confident and how to be more present and things. And that's not necessarily an underdeveloped strength of mine. I think that there are other kind of soft skills that women, there is insipid like sexism in the office. Like, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with these microaggressions and be able to address them in a way that doesn't put you as like the difficult feminist that's calling things out, but you're still calling things out and being respected in a workplace? I think they're really important elements of it.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And I think also, like, to your point, like addressing some of those underlying systems, because if we're saying, well, women aren't confident enough or need to be assertive, like where there's a problem in how we view women's, maybe some of the traits we more inherently possess. And again, not all of us, like, to be clear, but to really look at like what's going on that's giving rise to like why we behave or don't behave in certain ways or feel worthy or deserving of something. It's not, I read something to the effect of, we talk about women having imposter syndrome. And they said, actually, most women know that they're well overqualified for, jobs out there and the jobs their male, colleagues are doing. It's more the systems that aren't necessarily allowing them to like go forward for or be considered for those roles or whatever, maybe other restrictions that are in place, maybe because they are mothers and they're unable to like, take on certain responsibilities, whatever it may be. But it's like, the problem isn't necessarily that we believe that we think we can't do it. It's the systems
and I find
depending us in.
And I think, it's probably slightly off the topic of being child free, but these ideas around categorizing, like making women think that they should have imposter syndrome is like, I just see that as it's just like this insipid part of the patriarchy, right? And I think when we think about the challenges of the we've had this real culture in corporate world of bringing your authentic self to work for like the last 10, 15 years, right? This kind of blending of your personal and your professional and showing a little bit more of yourself. And, my experience of that is that the corporate workplace is not necessarily ready for like a woman in her full spectrum of who she
Yeah.
is. You
I
know,
don't think so.
this is somebody that women have opinions. They are forthright. They do challenge the status quo, and these are like innately feminine qualities for us to have. And but I think there's a tradition that we all know these kind of memes, right? A woman is seen as aggressive, a man is seen as assertive, right? The man is a strong leader and the woman is bossy. That's the experience of corporate life. And I would love to see more of a focus on helping support women really to, I guess, understand the impact of their authentic behavior in that workplace, and then thinking about how some of that behavior is received, and then thinking about how that corporate environment can be more accepting of these wider and really powerful attributes. But I just think there's always that point of when we have this kind of DEI training of like, if you ran it through a filter of like, would you say those things about a Black person? Would they come across as discriminatory? And I think these ideas about how women are often described as difficult is, if they were a man, that just would never happen. And I would love to see more support in that area.
Yeah, good suggestions. I'm glad you're here in the world with all of your ideas and making change, doing the hard work. I'm wondering, like, not even just in terms of like, and I know we haven't been speaking strictly in terms of your role, like relative to the organization, but like thinking in terms of colleagues, for example, and classic example, and this is like somebody being asked to do overtime because somebody else has to go get their kids from school. Would you say that has been your experience, that there's more pressure on you to take on additional responsibilities, time, et cetera, or has that not been the case?
I guess I'd flip it, that there's definitely been men and women who have kind of pulled the parent card for them to be able to leave early, not attend evening things, not have to do early starts, or more around, I've had to be flexible about when a meeting can take place because they have certain responsibilities like that. So that's definitely been my experience. And I think, there was one point in my career where every single person in my team took maternity leave or paternity leave in a year, and I didn't.
Wow.
And so I was the person that was picking up quite a few things through that time. And there is, and that does lead to resentment, like it really does. And I think there's a sort of hierarchy of priorities, right? So if you have to go and pick up your kid from nursery, of course you have to leave the office because there's this human being
can't be laying on the sidewalk by themselves.
And then also, I don't know if it's the same, but certainly in the UK, you get fined like £10 for every minute you're late or whatever. So there's this other incentive to jump on the train. But I might have a really important like dinner with my friends. I might have a really important yoga class I want to get to that's important for me in my life. And the idea that you would prioritize that and say, no, sorry, I can't do a call at that time, or I can't do a meeting, is just not respected in the same way you would be considered to be selfish or inflexible, or and so I think probably earlier on in my career I was much better at protecting those parts of my calendar and being like, I am leaving the office because this thing is important to me. And there's this sort of definite imbalance of needs of different employees, whether you have or haven't got children.
What do you think would potentially shift that, so the priority is not just one part of the workforce is the priority and then everybody else falls in line after that? Do you think that should be at the responsibility of the individual to, like you say, manage and protect time? Should it be something addressed organizationally, and if so, how? Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm sure it's a complex issue to tackle.
I mean, I feel like it's probably more of a generational issue, right? I'm Gen X. I am, so I would be the one that would like stay in the office and do the extra thing and not complain about it. And, whereas I do think younger generations are much better at, prioritizing their own life in a way that, there's lots of memes about these things, and I'm sure that the truth fills somewhere in between.
Yeah.
But there is this reality that, a growing percentage of women are not having children. So it's going to become a growing percentage in the workplace. And so that will inevitably have to change things. I think I've also noticed sort of since COVID and people working from home, there's definitely been this shift, certainly in the UK, of men taking a lot more responsibility, doing like school pickup or whatever, and understanding how and where you can fit that within your career. But I would just say ultimately, I think it is an individual's responsibility. You figure out what's important to you and what is the time protected areas of your calendar, and being firm with it, because otherwise you do, and I'm guilty of this, of kind of falling into these areas of resentment when everyone else can make their excuses because of their children.
Okay, so I mean, these are all big issues to tackle, but I feel like who better to do this with me than you? Now, I realize you're in the UK, and so your viewpoint probably looks a little bit different than people in other parts of the world, but I think it seems to be the case in general that we're seeing a rollback in terms of women's reproductive rights, specifically around decision-making, abortion, contraception, et cetera. And I'm curious, I mean, first of all, why do you think things have gone so wrong, if you will, or astray over the last few years? Like, what's giving rise to this extreme swing to the right, if you will, and taking away those rights? Now, I want to call them privileges, but they should just be, God-given, if you will. So
and I think obviously you probably have the US as your focus in that. It'd be great to talk about.
We're very international, actually, although I would say probably a good half of our listeners are in the US. So
I guess what I mean is
Germany, UK, Canada.
Yeah, I guess more that what we've been seeing in the US over the last few years is definitely. I mean, there are so many things I have to say about this, and in terms of like what's caused the rise of it, I think there is this rise of populism and polarization that has happened. But fundamentally, and I should declare also, in 2008, I worked on Barack Obama's campaign in Virginia, so saw some of this firsthand of how reproductive rights is an incredibly hot political topic in the US. So if you think about if we think about what are the kind of main factors of why you might vote in the UK, it would be around healthcare, so our National Health Service, it's immigration and the economy. Something as so specific as a single rights issue that reproductive rights wouldn't appear there. And in many ways, I find it really quite unfathomable that this debate around what women do with their bodies has taken up such a proportion of the political discourse instead of things like taxation, right? So if you think about taxation as something that affects a much broader perspective of the population, you can have some really fundamental ideas about how much you should be taxed on your property, on your income, and all these things. But we sort of, this obsession with women's bodies and what they should do with them is unfathomable. But this is kind of where we're at. And I think what happens in the UK is we have often thought, oh, that's just that thing that countries like America are focused on, and obviously there's a religious. It's a much more religious country than our own. But something quite shocking happened a couple of years ago here. So in 2023, a 45-year-old woman was actually imprisoned in the UK because she acquired abortion pills illegally. And then she used them on a pregnancy that was kind of beyond the legal term in the UK. That law was from 1861. That she was tried and put in prison. 1861. And I mean, it was repealed, and there was quite, it highlighted that we are in a society in 2024 where a law that was passed before women even had the right to vote in this country is being used by courts to try women about what they're doing with their body. So in many ways in the UK, we are still in need of looking at these things. I just don't think it's particularly as divisive, and it wouldn't be something that would be, right at the heart of an election. But I think this idea of the state having an idea of what you do with your body is sort of the ultimate expression of the patriarchy in the sense that it is now. I would say one thing around what I think needs to happen more is that there are more women represented in Parliament and in government. We've just had a recent general election here in July. We've got the highest number of women in Parliament now, but that's still around 32%. But we need more women round the table with the decision making there, whether it's repealing some of these antiquated laws or ensuring that there are protections there.
You're right as far as this being, predominantly a hot, at least election issue in the US, but I do think it's bringing attention to this matter in many other countries where it maybe is a given, like, oh yeah, it wouldn't really happen here. That's not relevant. And funny you mentioned that, because before our conversation, I did sort of do a quick search and find to say, okay, what's been happening in the UK as far as reproductive rights? And I think that case came up, and it's like I'd seen, I'm in Germany, but our neighbor here is Austria, that yes, you can get an abortion in Tyrol, which is one of their like big provinces, but there's one single doctor who will provide abortions. And so it's like, can you really get an abortion if there's only one doctor who can provide it in one particular part of the country? And I also think, so this is just a sidebar story, but I have these alerts that come up around words childless, child-free, and motherhood, because I always like to see what's coming up in the news around those topics. And if I see JD Vance, childless, and cat lady one more time, I'm going to scream. And I also am going to talk about it because I think what's interesting is how much this sort of cultural fascination, if you will, that's happening right now with the US election coming up, and this, comments that were made about childless cat lady, how much, I'm seeing people in all, friends of mine in Germany sharing memes and jokes about it and talking about it, how much of a preoccupation there's been in it. I think a lot of ways in a really positive way around what it means to be a woman who doesn't have children, and this notion of a childless cat lady. And I guess, do you think, I'm curious what your take is on that, because I think they say cats are having, like their best season ever, if you will, as far as all the focus that's been putting on them. I feel like this tactic has really backfired, because I think if anything, it's highlighting the power and strength of all women, but women's choices, women who choose not to have children. Like, is there an embedded fear in women who don't have kids, do you think? Is that why there's so much control around women's bodies, or do the two not have anything to do with each other?
Oh, they have everything to do with each other.
Okay, tell us more.
So, where do I begin? So, the idea of how we have, civil society and ordered society and making money and all of those things in sort of these Western democracies is that you have your 2.4 heteronormative family, and the woman makes lots of babies, and we're in this, often, the patriarchy comes out of kind of Christianity and this idea of the, this very heteronormative way. And so many, many laws in countries and the way that our societies have grown up is based on that model. Now, we're in 2024, and that model just doesn't work. There are people that aren't married, there are lots of different sexualities, different genders. And so this whole kind of fragmentation or challenge of this structure is entirely destabilizing and terrifying for a certain political grouping. And so the far right has sort of is really this open expression of that. And JD Vance is this very articulate, very prominent now mouthpiece for this. And so, yes, it's a meme of saying about, crazy cat or single cat ladies. And the one thing I just want to come out of that for these women that are outraged is that they get out and vote. They go and register and they get out and vote, right? Because this is, it might seem like it's a joke or these things, but if there are certain people that are in power that think that the way in which we need to kind of model a future society is that we are procreation and pronatal, I think is the term. Yeah. If that idea kind of reasserts itself, what that means is for women like myself and for all the, child-free by choice or fence sitters, you are now, you're kind of being dragged back to, Gilead, essentially, of this idea of how women should be behaving in society. And I think we have moved on so much from that. So I do think, sort of to specifically answer your point about reproductive rights and around some of this reaction to JD Vance. We're pushing up against really trying to deconstruct a very, very long structure around how the world works. And women like myself are confronting for that. And I think that a lot of this, should just say, by the way, because I'm sure I'm sounding like an ardent feminist to some, which I am, but
I was like, which you are.
Exactly. But
can we get shirts made that say ardent feminist?
Yeah, which is more around I think some of the resistance to, you'll change your mind, or I don't know what box to put this person in, because they don't, they're of a certain age and they should be having children, and they're not, and they're happy, and it's there's something on such a subconscious level that there are so many people, and through so many generations have been brought up of a certain model of society, and that model just, I'm not sure it ever did exist, but it certainly doesn't exist in 2024 in a lot of Western countries. And so I hope and pray that a lot of women in the US, but around the world, are conscious of this mission creep into an area that would ultimately affect them and their reproductive rights and their right to be child-free by choice. So yeah, get out and vote.
Amen. I was going to say, as a Canadian, which people may not know listening, not American, as a Canadian and a Brit, is that, I never know, a Britain, UK, like, is this interchangeable? Are you a Brit, or do you call yourself something else?
No, I'm a Brit.
Okay. You look confused. I'm like, I don't know, because we call it the United Kingdom, but it's Britain, but then
no, I'm
I get
British.
confused. We are British. Okay. I was like, I don't know what else to call you. Please vote Democratic, vote for Kamala Harris. Like, people say, oh, I don't want to get political. No, I want to get political, because this is political, and your reproductive decision-making shouldn't be, but will be largely dependent upon what happens in the coming years. So
yeah, look, I was working in Virginia in 2008 for Barack Obama's campaign, and the entire reason that state was won, not because of the precincts that I was responsible for, although we did have the highest turnout of the vote, was literally getting people that had never voted before, a lot of African Americans, educating people on how to get on the electoral roll and get out and vote. And that is the reason that state turned Democrat for the first time in 34 years, right?
Wow.
And so just being able, and I should declare that I used to work for the elections regulator in the UK, so fundamentally understanding how your democratic voice is important and can change things and change public policy is like so important. And I think the US election is a very clear expression of why that is. But just to really embed it back to this podcast, it's like women's rights are under threat. And I think the idea that of your ability just to be able to choose and be in an open society that values women that are child-free by choice or have alternative different lifestyles around how they want to bring children or not into this world is really important.
Yes. Thank you. I agree. I want to hear about your your career break that you're on right now, because what did you call it?
Oh, it's my maternity leave without a kid.
Okay, so tell us about this, what you've been doing. I want to hear about all the great things you've been experiencing.
Yeah, so I guess one insight of it is, so, I've worked pretty much nonstop for 20 years. And this idea of taking this break from my career at this point, which I'm thinking a lot of women would have already had their children, the idea of sort of taking a step back, on the one hand, is completely terrifying. That will you become irrelevant in your industry? Will you get rusty? Will people want to hire you after this break? And I had to sort of sit and think to myself, like, that if an employer thought like that about a woman that had gone on maternity leave, like, you'd be, and I'm sure it's probably illegal. So I think there was that element. And also back to that point around, we talked about work earlier, like, I have felt resentment of all these benefits that you have at work. You have extra leave to get married, you have maternity leave, you have your IVF paid for, you have, time off for miscarriages. Like, all of that is super important. And like, I'm not saying that shouldn't be there, but there's all these kind of benefits that I've never been able to use or take advantage of. So I think, whilst I'm not saying this is like a maternity leave, because what I mean is, when someone gets to take time off, whether it's maternity leave or paternity leave, you get to reassess what you want to do with your career. You get to not be sat at a laptop all day and just live a different life and see how other people live their lives. And I think that's such a valuable life experience to have. And so I'm very grateful to have this time to do that. And, I've spent a lot more time with my family than I would have done. I've been able to travel a lot in my camper van. I've been able to lay in bed and read books in the morning and just all these things, and just really think long and hard about how I want this kind of next half of my life to be. And I encourage everyone to do it. It's really important to get off the corporate treadmill every now and then.
I couldn't agree more. If there's an opportunity people can take, if you can make it happen somehow, some way. And of course, we need to live, we need income. And which brings me to one of your side gigs that you've got right now, something that you're doing, which you talked about being a single, what did you say? Single cat lady, and then single child-free cat lady. And then you said, well, more of a dog lady. So you are doing some dog sitting. Is that correct?
That is, yeah.
How did you decide to do that? How did this come about?
Kind of organically. So, so when I was with my longtime partner, we fostered dogs for a few years. I've always grown up with dogs, just never had the right house environment, or, I used to travel a lot with my job before and lots of late nights. So it's never been the right time to have a dog of my own. But maybe for the last few years, I've looked after dogs in the street, like neighbours' dogs. And then recently I've sort of moved this into a more professional setting using Rover, the app that many dog owners might know of, how you can book dog sitters. So yeah, I've got a kind of good bank of local dogs that I look after in the area. And it's just, earning a little bit of extra money to keep things going. So yeah, it's fun, and it's just fun having different types of dogs around, and it's helping me to decide what kind of dog I might have in the future at one point.
You said it's made you, and not everybody will know this term, but I do, because they use it in Australia as well. It's making you a little bit clucky. So we can say her ovaries are aching for a puppy, so to speak. It's like she's got that maternal urge. So I'm curious to hear about this. What's that been like?
So, I've always wanted a dog, but I think I'm now at a point where maybe the way I want to spend my weekends, the way I want to kind of would be slowing down in a way that would be more affordable to a dog. But I am finding myself just like looking at different dog breeds, like going down rabbit holes of like what their temperament's like and whether I could have them, and thinking about names for them. And I'm like, gosh, is this what people that want children, is this the kind of things that they do? So I was joking with my best friend at the weekend, was showing us some like videos of a Patterdale that I wanted, and she was just like, wow, you've got it bad, you've got it bad. I'm embracing it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I posted a meme yesterday, and it was talking about, this notion we're going to just know that we want children, or if we want children. And someone said, that hasn't happened, but I just knew I wanted a dog. And we're being a little bit jestful, but I think it's worth looking at. Like if there's something you really want and you become immersed in it, and you're excited about it and you're thinking about it and you're Googling it, like, we know how that looks. It shows up in other areas, like with Kate and the dog. And so it's not to say if you're not doing those things, it means naturally that you don't want a child. I'm not saying that, but I think it is worth noting that our bodies and our emotions, like, they tell us and show us when we're excited about something.
Yeah, I would say one thing. So another thing I used to say very jestfully, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, but very jestfully, when people say to me, like, do you want kids or whatever? And I'm like, no. Kids, marriage, and tattoos are all as equally terrifying to me because of the amount of commitment that they require. So I'm really difficult about deciding what jewelry to wear or what artwork to have in my house, because it's like, it's going to be there for a long time. And so I'm noticing in myself, even though I'm really desiring and thinking about a dog, is these worries about commitment. And it's like, well, that's like 10 or 15 years. I've
Yeah.
got to get up every morning. I've got to think about their care here. Like, what happens if I go on holiday? And so the sort of that pressure of the responsibility is feeling really weighty on me. And for that reason, I'm not going to do anything about it now if I ever do. But there's definitely a running theme of committing to something long term is quite terrifying for me. So that idea of committing to a child is like too much. Whereas a dog, maybe at this age, I might do it.
Yeah. I relate a lot. And let me tell you, I remember when we got Shira, she was about 6 months old. And, most dogs, they say, live 10 to 15 years. It rains a lot in Vancouver, which is where we lived when we'd adopted her. And I remember it was probably the first week we got her, and I was out for yet another walk in the rain. And I can remember doing the math and being like 3 to 4 times a day times 365 days a year times that. And I just like almost had like terror about the length and the weight of this commitment I'd made. And I've probably mentioned it on the podcast before, but I sort of have this like working theory that when and if we get a dog, it's like gateway baby or birth control. And I see with a lot of women, especially if they're like of a certain age, that dog, it shows them or kind of, and people say, oh, first you get a dog, then you're going to have a baby. Not necessarily, but it is the case for some women. And yet for me, it was birth control. I love my dog, but it showed me the boundaries of how much I want to commit and have responsibility to another creature. And I can remember on a meme I made on Instagram saying, I was kind of saying, going back to when I was on the fence, I said, I'm on the fence. I'm thinking my dog's too much responsibility. And somebody kind of snarkily said, if you think your dog's too much responsibility, you better not even think about having a kid. And I answered, oh, don't worry. This is past me. I've made that decision. But I do think, and I've encouraged people before, but like thinking about if you have a pet or if you've thought about it, what that relationship has felt like or been like for you, I think can be an indicator of how you may feel about this bigger proposition of having kids. So I still would encourage you to get a dog, but we can talk about that offline. Especially if you have a camper van, you need a little dog in your camper van, like all the Instagram girlies with their dogs in the van.
Yeah, I don't have a garden, and I know the type of dog. I mean, these are some things I'm being very responsible in that I know the type of dog I want, and in terms of having a garden it's not the right time now, but it will be. Yeah. We're just laying the foundations.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well, before we wrap up, Kate, I have 5 questions that I ask all my guests. Rapid fire. The first 2 are finish the sentence. So being child-free is?
Wonderful.
I knew you were going to say that. It was like wonderful. It's on the tip of her tongue. Being child-free is not?
Selfish.
Good one. All right. What is one particular tool or resource you think might help people with the decision of whether to have kids or stay child-free?
Oh, I would recommend a book by Emma Gannon called The Success Myth. I read this just at the beginning of my career break, and it's around redefining success. And I think if we think about we've touched on a lot of these topics on this podcast around definitions being like, you've got the house, you've got the husband, you've got the kids, and just some of the elements of that book really redefine what success can mean. And so I think that's really helpful when you're going through that process of like, you won't be less than and you can still be successful in all of these other ways. She has also written a novel about which I'm sure you know about. But this is a nonfiction which I found really interesting, and I think it was only published 6 months ago, so it's quite a new book.
Well, and so I've been wanting to read that book. Emma Gannon, fun fact, is child-free by choice. She's from the UK. And her book, Olive, is in our kids or child-free book guide, where I have 25 different books. And Olive is the protagonist in this book. She's child-free and sort of grappling with this decision. And as you can appreciate, if you're going through this decision, that is not something highlighted very often in fiction, in art. So the success myth, is it?
Yeah, the success myth. And I would say also just on Olive, as a book I've read, I think she does actually really encapsulate and articulate a lot of how I've felt and thought, particularly in my kind of 30s around that. So it's pretty accurate. I think it's not written as a way of like someone that doesn't know about that as a human experience. It resonates. Totally. It really resonates.
No, I agree. I thoroughly enjoyed the book as well, and also found it really relatable. What is one thing that you would like moms to know?
That it's okay not to love motherhood all the time.
Yeah. I think we need to give permission to moms to feel that way. And similarly, you don't have to love being child-free all the time. You can miss out on things if you do. Like having permission to feel and experience all the emotions. And
Yeah, and maybe not, yes, being child free by choice does come with a lot of personal freedom and economic freedom and all of those things, but it's a choice that is going against the grain of society, which is actually quite hard. We haven't really got into that as much, but sort of, I guess, circumstantially, like it's quite hard being the salmon kind of fight, going in the opposite direction to a lot of what society and how it's set up, and even around the tax breaks you get for certain things, and like we are a minority, and that can be hard.
Yeah, I agree. Is there anything further you want to say on that? I hate to let you go if you haven't been able to share your mind on something.
Yeah, I guess it's the one that's always been, I've always been someone that's thrived on being quite different and contrary and like, standing out from the crowd. But I appreciate that's not what everybody either has a natural disposition or wants to be. Like, we all want to belong as well. And I think just having the life path of child free by choice, you are almost on a daily basis kind of pushing up against that. You're going against the grain of the patriarchal societies that most of us live in, and that just could be a bit of a drag sometimes, but keep going. And I would say, I think I feel like I'm the tail end generation, right? Gen X, of the tail end of it being something that's questioned, that you are the kind of single cat lady. I think that my impression is, I don't know how accurate this is, but the proportion of people that are child free by choice is growing. The diversity of sexualities and genders and how people want to live their lives is kind of changing. And so I just feel like the pressure to fit within that one model will hopefully there'll be less friction for others.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And I would say, as an elder millennial, it seems to be moving more in that direction. Yeah. Okay, last question is, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would you tell them?
To really listen to yourself and your own intuition and knowing of what is right for you versus this kind of projection of what you think society should do. And I mean, obviously these are decisions often made with a partner. And I think just having the time and self-reflection for what you think you want and need for yourself, and then being able to either open that discussion to another partner. And then my additional bit of advice would be that once you have made that decision, you have no responsibility to anyone, including the guy from Paris that I met in Madeira, right? I don't know why I spent so much of my energy trying to explain my decisions to essentially a stranger. And I think that's part of it, of like, you don't have to explain your decision or choice to anyone if you don't want to.
Yeah. I'm glad we came full circle to the guy in Madeira. Thank you for that. All right. Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate you coming on and for this conversation. Where can people find you if they have feedback on this episode or they want to share something with you? Is LinkedIn a place?
Probably LinkedIn's the best place. Obviously, I'm a public policy professional, open for work. It would be great to connect with anyone there, and if this has resonated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in for this latest episode of the Kids or Child Free podcast. I hope you found that conversation insightful and valuable. And if you did, I have a special request to make. And that is, I would be so appreciative if you would go leave a review or a rating over on Apple Podcasts or leave us a rating on Spotify, both of which can be done via the Apple Podcast and the Spotify apps on your mobile device. If you go do that, that is going to be a huge help in helping the Kids or Child Free podcast get discovered by more listeners, more people like you who are on the fence seeking clarity with this decision. So hop on over. I mean, if you're listening on your device, you're probably there right now. It'll quite literally take you anywhere from like 10 to 20 seconds. leave us a rating. Again, you can do that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Or if you're on the Apple Podcast app, you can also leave us a review with some kind words sharing what you think about this podcast and why you suggest other fence sitters should tune in. Thank you in advance for doing so, and I wish you a beautiful rest of your day.